Welcome to everybody. My name is Ryan Petrazine. I'm an assistant professor here at the School of Political Studies upstairs at the University of Ottawa. And I'll be chairing and moderating today's event. So I'm really pleased to have this turnout for this event, which is featuring a discussion of how the global nuclear industry is faring and what that might mean for energy market transformations and for climate change mitigation efforts, both regionally and internationally. So we're really lucky to have three distinguished guests today, including our main presenter, Mycle Schneider, the convening lead author and publisher of the World Nuclear Industry Status Report, Catherine Abreu, give a little wave, Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada, and Ralph Torrie, President of Torrie Smith Associates. And I'll introduce our speakers more thoroughly in a moment, but first I just wanted to say a few things. First, I want to thank our institutional sponsors who made this event possible. So my sincerest thanks go out to the Center for International Policy Studies and Smart Prosperity Institute. Thank you very much. Second, I want to note how this event is doubling in a way as the Canadian launch of the World Nuclear Industry Status Report 2017, or WNISR 2017. The WNISR offers the leading independent analysis of the industry, providing a comprehensive overview of nuclear power plant data, including information on operation, production, and construction. And this year's report offers a number of new contributions to the discussion, including notably a chapter called Nuclear Power versus Renewable Energy, which provides global comparative data on investment capacity and generation from not only nuclear, but wind and solar energy. In his foreword to this year's report, David Freeman, the former chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority during the Carter years, claims, and perhaps not uncontroversially, but he says this report, quote, makes clear in telling detail that the debate is over. Nuclear power has been eclipsed by the sun and the wind. So we have a lot to talk about today, a lot to discuss. Before we begin, a quick note on today's order of events. After a more formal introduction, we'll hear a 40-minute presentation by Mycle Schneider, and then I'll introduce each of our policy discussants before their allotted 5-minute reflections. And finally, we will open up the floor to discussions and questions from the audience. So without further ado, let me introduce Mycle. Mycle Schneider, as you know, is the convening lead author and publisher of the annual World Nuclear Industry Status Report. He's also a founding board member and spokesperson of the International Energy Advisory Council in the United States and the coordinator of the Seoul International Energy Advisory Council, which advises the Seoul Metropolitan Government in South Korea. In 2007, he was appointed as a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials, based at Princeton University. He has spent decades working in a variety of capacities as a consultant, advisor, educator, media commentator, and expert witness. As an advisor and consultant, some of his former clients include the European Commission, the European Parliament's General Directorate for Research, the French Institute for Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety, the International Atomic Energy Agency, Heinrich Boll Foundation, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, the German Environment Ministry, the French Environment Minister's Office, the Belgian Minister of Energy, and you get the picture. As an educator, he's lectured and taught at 20 universities and engineering schools in 10 countries, including notably his work in the Environment and Energy Strategies lecture series at l'École des Mines in Nantes, France. Aside from authoring and publishing WNISR, Mycle is the co-editor of International Perspectives on Energy Policy and the Role of Nuclear Power, published by Multi-Science in 2009. Finally, I should note that in 1997, he was honored with the Right Livelihood Award, which, as some of you may know, is known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mycle Schneider.
Well, thank you very much for that long and kind introduction. I'm very happy to be able to speak here today. I've been coming to Canada for 3 decades without missing 1 year, and often I've been coming several times in a given years. And I've been doing seminars at Carleton and McGill, so I thought it's about time to do something at Ottawa U. So I'm really grateful to sponsors of the meeting, and one in particular of Ottawa U. So, a few words on the status report. It's been the 10th consecutive year that we've been producing this report, and of course, I mean, it's not me writing this report, it's a team of people. And to give you an idea, like last year's, we should maybe switch over to the other screen, that would be helpful. Like this year's report, it always changes a little bit, the authors, the contributing authors. It's 6 co-authors from 6 countries, and as you can see, there's like double nationalities of people born in one country and living in another frequently. It's a nice mix of nationalities on one hand, but it's also a nice mix of competence. There are like 3 energy policy experts, 2 physicists, an equity analyst whom I hired this year for the first time to have a more in-depth insight from an analyst point of view into the financial situation of some key companies, and a data engineer, plus the usual designers and webmasters and reviewers. So it's quite a team that puts this report together. Now, one of the biggest problems we have is it's getting bigger and bigger. Right? Every year it's like more pages. It becomes difficult to, when you write something new, you have to cut out something, but then you think, well, it's so much happened in the year, and then you want to keep it in, so it tends to get bigger and bigger. I think the first edition we did, the very first edition we did in 1992 had maybe 25 pages or so. So this is more than 10 times the volume. So it has really developed a lot over time. Now, the idea of this report is really to provide an overview of what you can call a carpet for debate. The nuclear issue is a strange issue. It seems a lot of debates and discussions seem to somehow hang in the air. Like people kind of throw issues, arguments, data on each other without agreeing on much to begin with. So we do this report to basically say, well, let's look at what we can agree upon as the underlying collection of numbers. So this report has a huge amount of numbers. It also has over 1,000 footnotes and references, because we want people to be able to go back to the sources that we use and that we quote. And people often appreciate that very much beyond the report itself, that they can actually use it as a research tool. While I go through, I'd be happy to take clarification questions, but please don't get into debate now, and I'm counting on the moderator to immediately cut off if this gets into debate. But clarification people tend to forget after, so that's fine with me.
Clarification's okay, but questions will lead to the
Yes. Okay. Here we go. So it's a multi-criteria, multi-indicator analysis. So first indicator here is reactor startups and shutdowns in the world over time. We always use the time trend as long as we can get the data, because energy policy is not an issue that you can look in for statistics on 1 year. It doesn't make any sense. So a picture, a photograph doesn't make any sense. You need to look at the film, at the movie, in order to understand what's actually happening. It's a long lead time industry, so it takes time to understand, and it's necessary to look back in history to understand why we are today where we are. So we see there were like 3 or especially 2 major startup waves. The first one in the 70s, the second one in the 1980s. And after that, it's a pretty flat development. With more or less startup shutdowns, but a pretty relatively flat development. Now we've seen in 2015 and 2016, two quite unusual years compared to 20 years before. So more reactors started up. In total, 10 reactors started up in a given year. That is more than in 20 years before. So an obvious question was, is this a change of a trend? So is that the beginning of a new trend? Or is it something else? Or it's an exceptional event? And we'll come back throughout the whole, all of the indicators to that issue. One point on definitions. Reactor startup for us is grid connection. And reactor shutdown is grid disconnection. So it is not a political decision or economic decision to shut down at a given point, but it's the physical grid disconnection that is for us the key date. And you'll find out that something which sounds as easy as that, startup, it might be more complicated to define, is like operation is not so easy to define. So this is the reason why this 2011 stack is actually getting longer over time, because we retroactively, when let's say a reactor is not generating power for 5 years, but they have not decided officially to shut it down for good, to close it for good, we cannot say it's closed down. So the year it's being closed down officially, we retroactively shut it down the year it produced the last electricity. Okay, just to clarify. So this is a stack that has been increasing every year since 3/11, the events in Fukushima happened. Now exactly the same graph, except highlighting China. So if you see what happened over the past 25 years, and especially over the past 10 years, it's very much China dominating the picture. In 2000, what did we have? 2015, 2014. That was already more than half of the reactors that started up. In 2015, it was 8 of 10 reactors, and in 2016, it was 5 of 10 reactors that were in China that started up. So China is really dominating that picture very much. Oh, I should say, one additional reactor started up in, Chinese reactor started up in 2017 first half. Since July, there's one other reactor that went online. So there's 2 reactors in China that started up. One additional reactor started up in Pakistan, but it was built by a Chinese company. So it's not in the country, but it's still the Chinese industry that built it. So very much dominated by China. Now, how many reactors are actually operating? If we go to what is the world reference, all the governments, all the international organizations use that. It's the International Atomic Energy Agency's Power Reactor Information System. This is a homepage, and it says current status 448 nuclear power reactors in operation. In operation. Now, in operation, what does that mean? In operation, you would think that is generating power. If we go into the select country line here and click on Japan, we get this picture. So it says operational 42, right? And if you go back, these 42 are well integrated into the 448 reactors. However, if you look at the share of nuclear power in power generation in the country, in 2016 it was 2.15%. You scratch your head and you wonder, 42 reactors operating generate 2.15%? That's quite low, isn't it? Well, the reason is very simple. It's not 42 reactors that were generating power in 2016, but as we speak, there's 5. So it's not the other reactors have generated literally zero power. So we consider that as a big problem, because this is the basis for decision making. These are the statistics that actually serve governance for decision making and trend analysis. So in 2014, we invented a new category. And the main reason at that point was the situation in Japan. As you see, reality was, in terms of capacity, there was this build-up. In terms of generation, this build-up. Here was a big scandal on quality control. And here we had 311 happening at Fukushima. And then it actually went down to 0. 2014, 0 kilowatt hours from nuclear power. But in the official statistics, still 40 reactors operating. So we think that's really highly misleading. So we started in 2014 to define a long-term outage category. So we say, we're not making that decision. It's the Japanese government or the utilities, or, it's not within our decision-making power to say this reactor is online or not online, or generating. So we say, we put the reactors into long-term outage from the moment on that it has not generated any power in the previous calendar year and in the first half of the current year. So 2016 plus first half of 2017 gets taken out. So as we see, as of the mid-year, we had 33 reactors in Japan in that category. 33. That's a big change, over the official data. And originally in 2014, when we created this category, we got the comment by saying, well, this is basically a Japanese category, right? This is not world analysis, so it's just specific to Japan. And in fact, if you look carefully, there were 2 reactors in France in that category. In other words, not generating any power for 18 months in a row. There were additional reactors in India, Switzerland, and Taiwan. So it is actually a phenomenon that happens in a certain number of countries. And we think that should be translated into the statistics. So this is our representation of reactors in operation. The build-up, uninterrupted, until the end of the 1980s. But then a flat development. We had the phenomenon of Fukushima, and we have a slight increase of the numbers since, but remaining far below the status pre-311. The maximum number of reactors was achieved in 2002. The maximum operating capacity, that's the red line, was achieved in 2006. And today we have, by mid-year, we had 403 reactors that we consider in operation, which is quite different from the official statistics, which is a difference of more than 10%. That's very significant. It's not a detail. So it is interesting that the World Nuclear Association, which is the lobby organization of the international nuclear industry, has put out in 2016 the first time what they call the World Nuclear Performance Report as a response to the World Nuclear Industry Status Report, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon that the industry reacts doing their own report as a response to the report that we had put out, so which de facto has become reference. Now this year they changed their representation of the reactors in operation and put in this category of not generating reactors. So they keep them and they have it in capacity, not in numbers of reactors. So you have still this kind of upwards going curve, but as a response to our category of long-term outage, they call it not generating capacity. So it's interesting. The status report has actually changed the representation of the nuclear industry of the situation of the nuclear power fleet. Now, those were reactors and generating capacity. This is electricity generation by nuclear power plants in the world. And we see that This was ongoing until reaching a maximum, increasing until reaching a maximum in 2006. We have a sort of a decline for the maximum for the share of in the electricity production of nuclear power. That the decline has been ongoing since 1996, falling from about 17.5% to 10.5%. So this is like a first important point to take in here. People think of Fukushima as having triggered a major crisis in the nuclear industry. This is not the case. It has accelerated a decline that had been triggered a long time before. It's not something new. It's not something that dates from 2011. Most of the indicators have been in decline before that. So who is actually generating nuclear power? 31 countries. Here we have the top 20. Two of the countries, US and France, generate about half of the global nuclear power alone. France is generating about half, just under half, of the nuclear power in the European Union. And as I said, it's only 31 countries generating nuclear power. So it's a relatively small number. It's less than 15% of the UN member countries generate nuclear power. And even in those countries, it's highly concentrated to a small number of countries. So the top 5 typically generate about 2/3 of the world's nuclear electricity. The dates we have put here, they're probably difficult to see from the back. We have to change that in the graphic design, I guess. But those are the years of the maximum electricity generation. And these are the years of the maximum share of nuclear power in that given country. And as you can see, if you take Canada as an example, the largest amount of nuclear electricity generated in Canada dates from 1994. So it's a long time ago. And if you look at the share of nuclear electricity in Canada, you have to, well, it's the same year actually, 1994. But you also have other countries like Finland, it's already dates from the 1980s, Belgium dates from the 1980s. So all these are, the peak for these countries has been a long time ago, and it's been declining since. Next indicator, reactors under construction. First phenomenon here is, I think it's very obvious. This huge mountain of reactors under construction dates from the late 1970s. So the peak was reached in the late 1970s, with at some point 234 reactors in the statistics as under construction. However, the second thing you have to understand, and which is obvious here immediately, is that a lot of these reactors actually get not finished. So the construction sites are abandoned at some point in time. The latest examples we had is in the United States, where in South Carolina, VC Summer, at the VC Summer site, they have spent, nobody knows exactly yet how much, but maybe $7.5 billion, and have decided to give up the construction because Westinghouse, the builder, went bankrupt. And I have read, I have not counter-checked it, but I have read that the electricity consumers in South Carolina, in that region that is covered by the electricity utility, spend about 20% of their electricity bill on a project that was never finished. Right? So the consequences are really significant in real terms. So a lot of these plants are, 48 of those 234 have never seen any grid. In total, it's close to 100, to give you an idea, that have been given up in various stages, from a few percent to 100%. Some reactors were actually finished and not switched on for safety or economic or policy reasons. Now, where do we stand today? This is a good example of why it's so important to look over the long term. If you look at the last 10 years, it went up beautifully, isn't it? You know, so you get the impression there is kind of dynamic, of significant dynamic in the new build, in the reactors under construction, and indeed the number had more than doubled, you know, in a few years of reactors under construction. But if you compare those numbers with what there was, you know, then it becomes a completely different message. So the turnover is actually relatively small, you know, compared to the past. The third thing is that we've seen now a decline, which is very substantial, over the past few years, going from a maximum of 67 down to 53. And this was 1st of July, 53. Of those 53, one was put into operation, that makes 52. And the 2 reactors in South Carolina have been given up. So as we speak, it's 50 reactors and not 53. And it's also an example how fast this area moves. I mean, some people said you should put out this report every month. I said, thank you, no. But it's, you know, the kind of newsworthy pieces of information is just staggering. The amount of changes that take place. So, which countries are building? No surprise, the only country really sticking out is China, with 20 reactors then under construction. And then some countries that, you know, Russia with 6, India with 6, UAE with 4, and the United States, that was before they stopped building the VC summer reactor, so it's in the United States, it's only 2 now as well. Now, the other piece of information here is that some of these construction starts date back quite a while, right? From the 1980s, you find some, and several ones are now over 10 years under construction. Of these 53, 37 were behind schedule. And it really is one of the pieces of, one of the indicators which we thought is interesting in pushing it further to understand what's happening. And we realized that of those 37 reactors that are behind schedule, 19 have increased their delay over the year. So since the last publication of the last report and this one, 19 reactors have increased their delays. So it's not something that is, you get behind schedule for some time and then you catch up, or then you know, or that you kind of push it all along until grid connection. But the situation actually worsens for over half of these plants. Maybe one more thing I should say on this. We had looked at the dates, you know, when we say scheduled grid connection, those are the dates that are given by the utilities or the industry as target dates. And for the year 2017, they were in total, all in all, 17 reactors that were planned to be put into operation, that were scheduled. And 11 out of these are already delayed. So 11 of 17 that were scheduled to come online in 2017 are now at least 2018 or beyond, or given up like the two US reactors. So at best, of those that are scheduled, we get 6 that would come online in 2017. So we see that that situation is kind of getting much more and more complicated over time, and not better and better. So we looked at great detail into construction, into building times, because the building times actually have a huge influence over the costs. Because obviously, as you know, if you delay a multi-billion dollar investment for a year, you have to finance that time for an additional year, and the financing costs are really a big share of the overall project costs. And we realized that there's basically no rule. So we had, over the past 10 years, 51 reactors that came online. The mean construction time was about 10 years. But the range is from 4.1 to 43.5 years. 43 years was a Tennessee reactor, what's bar 2? Well, as it indicates, it was originally started building in 1973. So it took a little longer. And I always thought this would be a nice PhD in economics to figure out what the financing costs of that project had been. You know, forget about the construction costs. Completely forget. Just dump it. Forget it. Just look at the financing costs of this project. I would find it very fascinating. So we see that some countries are doing better than others, but we also see that the range, even by the countries that do best, like China and South Korea, the range is getting bigger and bigger. So even these countries now see big problems with construction. It's not so easy, even in countries like China or South Korea, to push these projects through as fast as it used to be. And one key reason is quality control. I'm not going to go into this because it's a huge subject in itself. And quality issues are a big problem right now in various countries. We have seen Kobe Steel, which is one of the largest steel companies in the world, which turned out to have faked quality control certificates for decades. We have them now in nuclear plants, in airplanes, in chemical facilities, all over the place. A huge safety issue. We had a very similar problem in Korea, very similar, where they faked thousands of pieces in the nuclear manufacturing industry. We had the same story in France with a forge that was forging large pieces, and they were forging the documents that go with it. So it was a real forge. So quality assurance is a big issue in this industry. Now, to me, the actual construction starts are a very important indicator, because that is a sign when technically, under the technical definition of pouring concrete for the base slab of the reactor building, that is construction start. Not site preparation. That can take, years before. We have now several sites where they've been actually already spending about $3 billion or 3 billion euros on a reactor on 2 reactors that are not even under construction officially yet. So when we talk construction times, we always only look at base slab concreting grid connection, right? So the overall lead time of the project is much longer than that. Just to clarify how we define these. Now, but the obvious decision to build a nuclear reactor and go ahead with concreting is a very major investment decision. So it is an important indicator how the industry develops over time. Now, when you see this over the past few years, it's staggering. We've been going from 15 reactors, and here we really have it, Fukushima in fact, down to 10 to 8 to 1 in 2017, up to the middle of the year. And as we speak, end of October 2017, it's still 1, right? There's none has been put under construction since the middle of the year yet. And this one reactor was in India. So if we look at the role of China again, we see that these construction starts are almost entirely due to China. I mean, everything else is just secondary. It's non-significant. It's totally insignificant for the trend. But even China has gone down from 10 construction starts to 6 in 2015, 2 in 2016, and so far 0 in 2017. So we're in the course of wondering, we don't know yet, it's much too early, but we're wondering whether the Chinese exception is actually already over, right? It looks like it, but it's too early to say. Now, in the absence of much building, it's obvious that the average age of the fleet, the global fleet, is increasing every year. Now standing at 29.3 years. That means that over half of the world's reactors have been operating for 31 or more years. 64 for 41 or more years. I mean, 41 years old. Can you think back of what kind of technological age that was? I mean, we're back in the 70s, right? I mean, what did the cars look like at the time? You know? And if they were grid connected at that point, it means that they had been, the technology is still from 10 years early, at least, right? So we're talking about technology from the 60s and the 70s at best for these reactors. So it's a real issue. For comparison, the Canadian reactors are a little older on average than the world average. It stands around 34 years on average in Canada. So the Canadian fleet is pretty old. I'm rushing a little bit through here, so it's no big surprise that the real exception is China with a fleet age of 7 years. It's brand new. I mean, these machines are brand new compared to the world nuclear fleet. What is very interesting, what happened over the past 10 years is that we have entered a situation where the paradigm that said at the time nuclear power is very expensive to build, but once it's built, it's very cheap to run. That was the kind of baseline hypothesis. This is over. It's very clear now that running a nuclear reactor has become much more expensive. And it's no surprise. If you look at the age, I mean, it takes more money to keep a car on the road that is 30 years old than a brand new one. It's not really that surprising. It's also that some of these companies have severely underestimated investment needs for a long time. So they have to catch up with investments now, so that boosts the actual operating costs. And it led to a situation where more and more reactors here, in the case of the United States, are actually taken off the grid because they're economically not viable. So reactors that have actually lifetime extensions up to 60 years are getting taken off the grid at ages between 40 and 45 years. So much earlier than necessary under the licenses because they can't compete in the grid. And that situation is getting worse basically every year with decreasing cost of competing technology. Quick overview of the financial analysis. This is a share price development of some of the big companies. What is interesting, I just pay attention to the 2011 Fukushima effect on these various companies. I mean, this is very obvious. For TEPCO, that was the operator of the Fukushima plants, that they basically, their capital value was wiped out with those accidents. That's not really surprising. But what is interesting here is that more than half of that decline from the peak had already happened before. So don't get this idea again that it's all due to Fukushima. The nuclear industry was very severely hit by the international world economic crisis in 2008, between 2007 and 2009. And you can see it all over the place for the various companies in various countries. You have very large declines that are between 75% and over 90% in share value decline. Even for companies like in Germany or in France, I mean, look at the total wipeout of these publicly owned companies. Areva, when technically bankrupt, has been bailed out, but it didn't really help, did it? I mean, it was taken actually off listing now. So it didn't solve the issue. But again, you see everywhere that the big problems did not start with Fukushima at all. I mean, they were already in deep trouble when this happened. It didn't do them any good, that's for sure. But it didn't trigger it. Now, Korea was one, you look at all these companies and then you get Korea. Why is that? Please.
Yeah, just our dates were 2008, and you can take any company in 2008 you go down. Like there is no one company that can end in 2008.
So
is that a question?
Can we defer that to the question period? Or
It's very.
We'll get some first questions.
Look at NASDAQ. What's the value of NASDAQ today? It's higher than it was in 2007. So the companies have picked up since.
Yeah, I was speaking on 1 year. Like if you take just like 2008, everybody went down.
But that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say the entire period already left them damaged, and they never recovered. Look at the other industries. Most of the other industries, some of them are now way beyond what they were in 2007 or 2008. These companies never recovered. And obviously, there, 311 played a role. I mean, that didn't help to recover, that's for sure.
So we have about 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
I may have to cut you off.
So Korea is a little, seems like an exception because it was actually going back up, like other countries, like other companies. But in this case, it's basically the only monopoly left, like monopoly company left. They have a full national monopoly. It is interesting to see what happened since the election of President Moon, who basically the first thing he did, 1 month after he took office, he went to close the oldest reactor in the country, making clear he would not go for a lifetime extension. So the share value plunged. Then a citizens committee voted in favor of continuing construction of 2 reactors that were already under construction. So the share value went back up. And then the government clarified that it didn't change anything. If they finish these reactors, that doesn't change anything for the long-term phase-out policy. So Korea, which was like an exception out there, is now basically coming in line with the situation in other countries. The final, very quick overview over renewables versus nuclear power, which we have been monitoring for some time. So we have a total investment of over $240 billion compared to something we don't know exactly, what the value is. But what we did is we looked at the construction starts and allocated the total projected investment cost onto the given year. So what you can say, it's like 10 billion for nuclear power in 2016 versus 240 billion for renewables. That gives you a vague idea of what's happening in this sector. But you see there's a big decrease between the record year 2015 and this year. The interesting thing is that this was more than compensated by the drop in prices for renewables. So with less money, they actually added more capacity than they did in 2015, which is staggering. So it doesn't mean that there's a decline in capacity additions. It just means it's much cheaper than it used to. These are the top investors. Where's Canada? Oh, sorry, it's not under the top 10. So interesting. What countries are now? Even Belgium is in there. Australia is in there, and new countries. France wasn't in the top 10 until last year, so that's an interesting development. Here you see the capacity added since 2000 in the various technologies: wind, solar, nuclear. And here you see the added generation of power. And this is actually very important because, of course, the capacity, 1 megawatt in one technology doesn't generate the same amount of electricity. So one has to look at always both, capacity and production. So if you look, we took 1997 as baseline year because we wanted to see how much electricity has been added since the signature of the Kyoto Protocol, because climate change is a big issue, of course, in the background. And it's interesting to see that if you do that analysis, you see that wind alone has added more than 4 times the amount that was added by nuclear power. We get record low prices now for has a lot to do with the dynamic of auctions that have pushed down the prices, introduction prices for especially solar and wind dramatically. To give you an idea, a lot of these prices are now below $30 per megawatt hour. The operating and maintenance cost in the United States for nuclear power plants on average over the entire fleet of 99 reactors is $35. So it is cheaper now to build new solar than to maintain and operate a nuclear power plant on average in the United States. This is the situation in China. So although they build a lot of nuclear, the added amount of electricity by wind is still, wind alone is still more than nuclear. Situation in the EU, situation in India, and that's it. Let me take out. I'm not going to read this. You can read much faster than I can speak anyway. But let me pick out a couple of significant points. The first one is that if we do trend analysis, it is obvious that the bankruptcy of 2 of the largest builders, nuclear builders, the largest historic builder, Westinghouse, and the large public company in France, Areva, is very significant. It means, what does it say about the health of this industry? What does it say about markets and market developments? What does it say about management of investments? And I gave the example in the United States, which has dramatic consequences for every electricity consumer. The other point I would like to take out is that dramatic situation of nuclear companies, whether it's builders, service providers, or utilities, has at some point an impact on safety and security. And this is unknown territory. This is very difficult to regulate. I mean, how do you, when you have a social plan and you fire a few hundred people, when does it cut into safety and security? How do you measure that? And the tools are actually not out there. And this is really, to me, one of the major understudied and understood areas of concern about the nuclear sector as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was excellent. Thank you so much, Michael. And feel free to grab a cookie. And as we set up our respondents here, we have 2 excellent respondents, commentators, who will now take what we've heard and reflect in terms of the climatic implications for climate policy, climate mitigation efforts, as well as energy policy in a regional and domestic context. So maybe I'll just go ahead and introduce both of them. We'll start with Catherine Abreu. She is one of Canada's foremost sustainable energy campaigners with over 10 years of experience campaigning on environmental issues, including 6 years in the heart of the Canadian climate movement. She joined Climate Action Network Canada in July 2016 after 5 years leading the energy and climate change mitigation programs at the Ecology Action Centre, Atlantic Canada's longest-running environmental advocacy organization. She is also the former coordinator of the Atlantic Canada Sustainable Energy Coalition. Catherine has been honored to share the stage with some of Canada's leading environmental thinkers,
Can you leave it down?
including David Suzuki and Maud Barlow. Her commentary has been featured in the New York Times, Global Mail, Toronto Star, Financial Post, and Vice, and she appears frequently on CBC, CTV, Global, and other current affairs television programs. Maybe why I like being a familiar face. Catherine is a dedicated collaborator and community organizer. In the last decade, she's founded and or supported the work of 9 distinct coalitions, including the Nova Scotia Coalition for Climate Action, the Nova Scotia Fracking Resource and Action Coalition, the Maritime Sustainable Energy Transition Initiative, and I really like this one, the Ladies Beverage Room, a female DJ collective. So we'll hold on to your introduction until afterwards, Ralph, but please join me in welcoming Catherine for her
Ralph leaned over and said, "This comes out of your 5 minutes."
You can take it out of mine.
So thank you so much for that presentation. It was alarming to see that most of the world's nuclear fleet is older than I am. That doesn't feel very safe, but I really appreciate being invited to have a conversation about this issue today. So how many folks in the room have a sense that nuclear power is a contentious issue for environmentalists? So traditionally, the conversation around nuclear energy and the environmental movement, if I can kind of generalize, are folks who on the one side say it's not worth the risk, it's really dangerous, we don't know what to do with the waste, and it poses incredible catastrophic danger to human life and communities. And then on the other side, people say, but we have this looming climate crisis, and we need energy solutions to fix them, and a plausible energy solution is to invest heavily in nuclear energy because it is not emitting, and it can provide, or at least satisfy our demand for the services that we rely upon and that we use energy for. And so that's been a kind of big debate in the environmental movement for the last number of years, for the last few decades, I should say. My response to that has always been that investing in nuclear energy skirts around one of the core problems that leads to climate change and a variety of other issues in the modern world, and that is overconsumption. Ultimately, it is the kind of runaway consumption of energy and many other resources that lead to some of the environmental problems we have on our hands today, and nuclear energy only perpetuates that paradigm of overconsumption because it allows us to continue consuming energy and services at the runaway rate that we consume them today. And in fact, we need to be investing in energy conservation and energy resources that drive us toward a more conservation-oriented approach to energy and the services that energy can provide. But then, of course, people turn around and say, okay, sure, we need to think about conservation and getting rid of this overconsumption model that we've been working within for the last few decades, particularly in Western industrialized countries. But as we implement many of the solutions to climate change that we are wanting to invest in, like vehicle electrification or electrification of industrial processes, our demand for electricity is going to increase. And so once again, we have a justification for investing in nuclear energy. And to that, I say, take a look at this report. It's very clear that the cost and timelines associated with nuclear energy mean that even if you put aside the risk, even if you buy into the idea that we need nuclear in order to satisfy what will ultimately be a growing demand for electricity, the cost and the timelines associated with nuclear doesn't make it a viable option in that scenario either, because we need an electrification strategy that we can turn around in the next 15 or 20 years. And there are some nuclear reactors that have been under construction for 30. So I posit that with this and with the growing evidence that renewable energy is outpacing nuclear and many other traditional energy sources in terms of cost and deployment, we can kind of safely say that it's time to stop talking seriously about building new nuclear. How does this hit the ground in Canada? Well, indeed in Canada, if we are going to move forward with many of our climate strategies, including the decarbonization of our transportation sector, of our industrial sector, of our building sector, then an electrification strategy is going to play a prominent role in us fulfilling our climate targets. And indeed, we have an export-oriented economy, and the export of electricity is a major part of that. Exporting electricity accounts for about $3 billion of our export revenues nationally every year. Much of our export-oriented economy is greenhouse gas intensive, and so if we're thinking about how to move toward a less greenhouse gas intensive economy, then we have to be thinking about how to increase the lower greenhouse gas commodities that we export to other parts of the world. And because we're already exporting electricity, the idea of increasing the share of electricity, of non-emitting electricity that we are able to export and make export revenue from is probably our first kind of go-to when we think about export substitution in a climate-constrained world. And so, once again in Canada, we have this conversation about how do we kind of square the existing nuclear capacity that we have in this country, our desire to build new electricity capacity to fuel the various policy developments under our climate commitments, and how do we increase our share of clean generation in order to increase the amount of clean electricity that we export to other parts of the world. And I think in Canada, that conversation is likely going to be mostly about hydroelectricity and how we optimize our existing hydroelectricity supplies and think very, very carefully and strategically about new hydroelectricity builds. And then, of course, with existing and potentially new smaller scale hydroelectricity, we might be able to have some of the sort of grid capacity constraints that we face when we're trying to integrate intermittent renewables on the ground. So, of course, the storage capacity of hydroelectricity helps us to address some of the problems with those intermittent renewables. So it's not, in Canada, a nuclear solution. There is one place in Canada that kind of bucks that trend, and that is, of course, Ontario. In Ontario, we have 18 of the 19 nuclear reactors that are operating in Canada. 10 of them are currently being refurbished. Those refurbishments will likely increase the cost of electricity rates in Ontario by 55% by 2030. Incredibly expensive and already very dramatically over schedule. Why is Ontario so heavily invested in nuclear energy? I think that's a really interesting conversation for us to potentially have during the question and answer period, and no doubt Ralph has some things to say about his observations of the Ontario nuclear landscape. But I think it would behoove us to consider how Ontario and, of course, New Brunswick, which is the other province that has a nuclear reactor in it, will consider the eventual retirement of its nuclear assets.
Okay, I think we should probably move on, but excellent.
Ryan, I was going to suggest that anybody that wants to hear me be introduced, stick around after the session.
I would encourage you, though,
We're so
to
short
check
of
out this
time.
guy's bio, because he has had a long and storied career in this area. So please do check him out. Ralph Torrie, and let's hear what
Thanks,
he has
Ryan.
to say.
Yeah, I mean, time is pretty short if we're going to get into a discussion, and there's so much territory that one could try and address with the question or the request that Ryan gave, which was to contextualize the information that Mycle has provided in his report, in which many of you will notice when you read it, it's pretty hard to find references to Canada, except for one little section. we're just really not a player anymore, it would seem. One could talk about what could have been or what should have been. You've seen what did happen. What's going to be in Ontario, I mean, we've rolled the dice on this as a province. At least our government has on our behalf. We will have at least 12 large power reactors that we're reinvesting billions and billions of dollars in Ontario. And there hasn't been a commitment for a new one since 1978 or 9. So what we are doing in Ontario is rebuilding the large reactors that we do have. It costs as much or more as it costs to build them in the first place. So the term refurbishment is a little bit cute for what they're doing. But right now, nuclear power provides about half the electricity that's consumed in Ontario. That's coming out of these 3 sites. The concentration of energy is huge. But here's the problem as I see it going forward. Around the time that nuclear power is actually the crowning achievement of an obsolete paradigm. That's its great contradiction. It's strictly from the point of view of achievement on a scientific or an engineering basis or even a project management basis, even with the overruns, they are a sight to behold. I mean, it's pretty amazing. But around the time that we made that last round of commitment to it in the late 1970s, not only Ontario, but as you saw in the numbers, that was sort of the last heyday of nuclear power, with the resulting capacity peaking, as you saw, about 20 years later when those plants came online. And around that time, a small and since then a growing number of people have started to rethink, reimagine, and reinvent the whole energy system. And it's being fueled by innovative new technologies which can be designed and built and redesigned and rebuilt 7 or 8 times during the time it takes to build one nuclear mega project. We've seen dramatic seismic changes in the relationship between our use of fuel and electricity and the structure and size of our economy. Our consumption of fuel and electricity is growing hardly at all, even while our population and our economy moves forward, partly because of efficiency, but also largely because of changes that are going on throughout the Western world towards a new economic structure with a new energy system that goes along with it, particularly in the electricity sector that's much more distributed, in which resources are it looks a little bit more like the kind of system some of us envisage might be a sustainable energy system. When we first started thinking about this those 40 years ago, it would run on renewable energy, it wouldn't produce waste, it would be efficient, it would be resilient. If it failed, the technologies would fail in safe ways. It wouldn't introduce geopolitical risks to the security system through the production of fissile materials. It would have social technologies associated with it which were convivial and consistent with democratic and with our democratic and social traditions. Nuclear power fails on all of these features of the emerging energy paradigm. It's extremely inefficient. The best we do in Canada is we get about 30% of the energy in the core out in the form of electricity. The rest is dumped into the lake as waste heat. It produces waste. It runs on non-renewable fuel. It introduces dangerous links to geopolitical security. It's not flexible. It doesn't follow the load. It's very capital intensive. It's very risky. That's the bottom line. That's why private capital has never been interested. There are no nuclear programs that are not indemnified by governments against the risks that they're taking, and in many cases don't have their rates of return guaranteed. Whatever else you might think about private capital, it's not stupid. And it's avoided taking that nuclear risk right from the beginning. And I don't see that changing. So, bringing it back to Ontario, it's like having a hippopotamus at a ballet. We've got this we've got this set of nuclear plants. We're re-injecting these billions of dollars. 13 billion is the estimate to rebuild Darlington. If they can get it done for 20, they will break all their previous records for keeping their costs under control. So it's going to be expensive. It has to operate because it's so capital intensive. It can't be on and off depending on the whims of when people flip switches. And we're stuck with it. We're stuck with that bill, even if we shut the plants down. The capital has got to be repaid. So we're really between a rock and a hard place now in Ontario in terms of this gamble. Plus, nobody builds them anymore, especially not Candace. It's going to be like owning a fleet of 1951 T-birds. It's just going to get more and more expensive over time, and the number of people that even remember how they went together and how they were built will get smaller and smaller. So it's like trying to enter the new, exciting, emerging energy system with a big lead weight tied around our legs. And I don't know how it will, I don't really know how it's going to play out. I don't know if the nuclear plants will survive the next 10 or 15 years in Ontario. If solar and wind and the other distributed resources keep improving in their economics the way they have been, not to mention the revolution in the efficiency of energy use that informatics is making possible, it might be very difficult for those reactors to find markets for their power. But the bill will still have to be paid. So, meanwhile, just one final dynamic in all of this. You can go on and on about all the moving parts, but climate change, as Catherine has already noted, generally most people feel that our only way through that is through a massive increase in our reliance on electricity, which is at a pretty small level, believe it or not, in Ontario right now. It's only 20% of our total energy is, and it's been stuck at that number for years. So that's some context. Maybe we should just throw it open and see where it goes.
Well, thank you both, Catherine. We have about 20-25 minutes for discussion, questions, and I suppose we'll grant comments if they're concise and to the point. Is there anyone with their? Okay. Before we go to you, did you want to ask your point again that you mentioned?
No, I was just making this careful. So we cannot just say, look, it went down before that. There is an explanation for that.
So let's see if there's how many. If we just have the one comment, okay, and then and if you don't mind, if you could introduce yourself before you. That's exactly.
Yeah. I'm Peter McKinnon. I'm an academic here at the university. Just to put on the level playing field to start with, it seems that you're talking at cross purposes, although the rebuttal here mentioned it a little bit. And that is nuclear power, like the electricity hydro, is continuous. And the renewables we're talking about are subject to when the wind blows, when the sun shines. So there hasn't been any discussion about the substitution of these energy sources. In other words, renewables is fine, but it's not going to be able to supply the fixed, fixed stuff. So how is this all going to work out at the end? You haven't separated those two things.
If I can tag on to that, because what we were talking about Schellenberger at lunch, but he's a proponent of nuclear power. He talks about this issue of baseload, and he suggests that this is leading to an increase in burning natural gas during those periods when the sun is not shining. So I'm also curious to hear your responses. Feel free to jump in, or we'll start with that one.
Well, I guess the key point to understand is that is basically a point of view like from the 70s, where the idea of solar was just generating a bit of power, and wind a bit of power, while nuclear power was generating a lot of power, and we had this whole idea of base load, middle load, peak load. That concept is dead.
We still have mobile versus fixed.
No, I'm trying to come from a completely different side. I think that the key word today is flexibility. So it's not anymore the question to supply steady load, but to be able to actually react to demand in the most flexible way. And it happens so that nuclear power is the most inflexible way to respond to demand. So we're not, the way to talk about base load is something that is today of it in a completely different nature. It's not, the structure has changed dramatically. And what people don't realize is that, we always say, well, then you need, the dumbest people in that debate say we need for every solar, we need a backup power source when the sun doesn't shine. Dumber than that, you die, because it's not the point. It's like having electricity 24-hour, whether you need it or not. So the question is, what are actually your demands at what time of the day, and how you can cover these demands? That's the question. And the demand is not even kilowatt hours. The demand is the service. It's heat, cold, lighting, etc., etc., etc. And that today is, the opportunities are endless, right? You can store electricity in heat, in cold, from batteries to flywheels to there's so many technical options to just even store it.
It's not done at scale yet.
Oh, it is done. It is done. In a lot of countries, it's done on scale. The point is that scale is not the same idea anymore we had before. So we're not talking mega, we're talking micro. And the future grids, I'm wondering today whether in 2030 there will be still a national grid. I'm wondering, I don't know. I'm not saying I'm pro or against, not the point. But what I'm saying is what we see now from a technology development point of view is that you can do basically everything on a micro scale. And then you scale up. But it goes from micro to scale up, and not the other way around. And that's where, it's the dinosaurs ballet. It's where it's just not, it doesn't fit together. It's the whole idea also to say we mix, or we complement nuclear by renewables or renewables by nuclear. That doesn't work. You will come to system issues very quickly. And you see it in countries like Germany. There's a lot of things that don't work in Germany, but mainly because of system issues, not because of the basic idea to go all renewables. It's the size issue that remains the strongest problem.
Anything to add before we have two other questions in the audience that you wanted to touch on this?
Let's get the other comments on the floor.
So there was a question in the second row here, and then we're going to go here.
I was just hoping for a comment on the recently released Ontario long-term energy plan, which seems to embody that doubling down on nuclear, as maybe the bishop would say. If you could just say anything more about that, since that didn't actually come up.
And does that ring a bell with either of your two questions? Okay. So you want to...
Let's get them all up
Okay.
on the floor, and then we can...
Let's hear and then...
Yeah, so I just want to pose the obvious question.
Can people please introduce themselves?
My name is Angela Calabresa,
Okay.
and that's why is the government of Ontario that is politically concerned with high energy costs and keeping them down. So set on this extremely costly nuclear refurbishment path.
And your name is?
Ol Henderson with various paths.
Okay. And we'll go to another question here, and then we'll...
Diane Beckett. I just want to say this university is really good at this whole systems thing. They dump heat into their swimming pool and pull it out. Like it's totally, they cut the amount of energy hugely here, even though the university's gone up 3 or 4 times, and it would be good just for people to talk to how this place runs.
There was one more question.
Okay, so we'll take one more, and then we'll...
I had a question that so my name's Michelle, I work with Sustainable Development Technologies Canada. The question about scale and innovation is really where I'm coming at this from. My assumption is that the conversation thus far has been about mega projects when it comes to nuclear, and we're talking about a lot of innovation that's happening with renewable technologies to sort of take place, including storage, that gap that's happening. There's actually correspondingly a lot of innovation that's happened in nuclear as well, not only in terms of bringing down the scale, but mitigating the risk that we talk about. The geopolitical angle that we spoke about largely comes from the idea of uranium and plutonium being used as a base fuel. There's also other technologies that can make it modular and shut down the reactor automatically in the event of some kind of failure. So I'm just curious when, sorry?
That's the dream.
Well, I
Well,
would contest that it is not a dream. So I'm just curious, should that dream, as I see it happening, be something that could happen? Where would you say that plays, or is that just a non-starter conversation?
Okay, so we have a couple questions on the table. I think we'll start with Ralph.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I don't know how long you plan to go. People maybe have other commitments, but I think that first of all, the Ontario Long-Term Energy Plan, which has just been released, there weren't really any surprises there. It's a regurgitation of the position that this government has taken over the last few years, which is to commit to keeping the plants we've got running, except for Pickering A, which will be shut down. Some people would like to see it shut down sooner than later. You increase your risk when you operate an ancient nuclear plant like that, but by 2024, at the latest, that plant will be shut down. And 50 or 60 years later, we'll clean up the site. I think that why the government is so committed to this, wow. I mean, that's like the story of my life, trying to answer that question. It goes back really deep with Ontario. When that obsolete paradigm that I referred to, of which nuclear is the crowning achievement, was peaking in its influence and power over business and policy, this would be in the 1960s and 70s, where growth at all costs was the objective, and the belief was that you could only have growth with more and more energy, which was completely wrong, but that was what fueled both business strategies and government policies. And when we ran out of new hydro sites, and somebody came along with nuclear, an industry which has always been a technology push kind of industry, the province committed to it. There was a bit of flag waving around the can-do concept, which probably was in the mix as well. But this goes really deep and all the way back to the conservative regime that lasted for all those years through the 60s and into the 70s. And there hasn't been a government since that sees a way to undo it, even if they wanted to. So it takes it's just something like watching someone at a casino trying to decide whether to cut their losses or double or nothing. And we just keep doubling up on it, hoping that the payoff will come with the next roll of the dice. Books have been written in an attempt to address your question. I think on the final point about the small modular reactors, you know, there have always been nuclear power reactors that operate safely, in budget, that are built on time, and it's always the next one. Those reactors are always the ones, sort of like next year's vacation. It's perfect until you take it. And so with the small modular reactors, which are not that small, by the way, they're looking at 200 and 300 megawatts. So this is a big machine compared to the, you know, one of the characteristics of a sustainable energy system is that it be matched in scale and thermodynamic quality to end uses. That will never happen with a 200 megawatt machine that's throwing out 400 megawatts or 350 megawatts of heat into the atmosphere as waste. It's just antithetical to any kind of a internally consistent understanding of what an ecologically sustainable energy system might look like. Doesn't mean it won't happen, but it doesn't fit in the new paradigm in my view. And when you look at where they're talking about putting these things in Ontario, remote communities on diesel generators, it's like, oh, not again with a technology push. You know, this is one of the tragedies of this industry is that it always has been a solution trying to force problems to fit instead of the other way around. And so they've got a small reactor. They will try and find some problem or reshape some problem to make it work. But those of you who have lived or visited for extended periods northern remote communities, contemplate for a moment having the local community energy system be a small nuclear power plant. It's just the same kind of mistake we made going into it. Sorry, I've gone on too long, but I tried to touch on.
We'll probably be kicked out of the room in 15 minutes or less. So, Mycle, why are SMRs just a dream?
Well, I mean, SMRs, the basic idea has been around forever, right? It's not like something innovative. We have been using the term innovation, right? And, you know, SMRs is everything but innovative. Like, they've been around forever. And if you look at the concepts that have gone the farthest, it's, for example, the pebble bed modular reactor in South Africa, right? Where there were pre-orders, there was like huge amount of money went into these reactors. Try to find the website, pbmr.com. It was simply taken down, and the whole thing was totally dismantled after spending over $1 billion on the whole thing. We did a careful analysis, historical analysis. I'll invite you to read it from 2 years ago in the status report. And you know, we didn't redo that last year. And then people kept talking about SMRs. So I said, I commissioned an update. So I invite you to read the update this year in this report on the SMRs. And the basic message is, the industry has never delivered. And the SMR is really one of the best examples. And I can tell you, it's like generation 4 concepts. You know, many of those concepts have the same thing, have been around in principle, like lead-cooled reactors, sodium, fast reactors, etc. It's been around forever, the basic concept. So the discrepancy between the promise of new, innovative nuclear solutions and delivery is so huge that the industry has to come up and put something on the table to become credible. And so far, is what we can say from experience, from historical, empirical evidence, is that it's going to take another 2 decades, or 3 decades, or 4 decades, right? If ever something was delivered. Excuse me, I'm not interested. I think the climate change issue is an urgent issue. So we have to deliver within, what, 20 years?
15.
15? No, but I mean, that's, so what can you do in 15 years? The nuclear industry was able, in the entire world, to connect 50 reactors in 10 years to the grid. That's all. That's nothing. It's absolute peanuts. It's irrelevant to the climate change. It's completely irrelevant. So if the industry now says, oh, we have innovative concepts, evidence that this is not going to be the same thing as we can have demonstrated for the previous decades. And that evidence I've never come across. As simple as that.
Okay, I'm wondering if we're going to be kicked out of the room soon. Is that message stuff for us? No?
No.
Do we have time for another question or two? Okay, yeah, can you introduce?
Okay, my name is Felix Lortel, and I have a question. I don't know. It's a rhetorical question in that panel, I guess, but I challenge the fact that you are the political science part of it. And the question really is it not part of the problem, the fact that there is a huge cost related to the decommissioning of the nuclear plants at the end of life? And is it not some kind of, line of thinking that we need to keep up with an industry, whoever keeps those plants operating to cover the cost of the commissioning afterward? And obviously in the economy they tell you this sunken cost and it's better to cut that thing as soon as possible, but that probably requires some political, I don't know, bravery, well,
it's a very true point. It's a real problem. And it's very clear that today we have a dynamic which is very dangerous, which is where we don't have a clear table there, because, we have the case now for some US plants that are, where the decision has been taken to take them off the grid in spite of the phenomenon which you've been describing. So they analyze what is in the decommissioning fund, allocate it to that plant, and realize there's not enough in there, even for the estimated cost of decommissioning, which by all experience is never true, but is always, you know, a lot more in reality than what they say. It's, by the way, it's one of the issues for France in particular, because France has a very large fleet, 58 reactors, all run by the same company. And they have allocated in a dedicated fund roughly 300 million euro per reactor. But if you look at historical evidence in relatively good access countries for information on that data, for example, Germany, where there's several plants now under active decommissioning, so they know what they spend. The ballpark figure is 1 billion. So if you only have 300 million in the fund, but you need 1 billion, the question is, how do you deal with that on the long term? And you're quite right that the whole economic calculation is always to say, well, we only decommissioned them in 20 years, so what we need now in the fund is very little compared to what we need, you know, inflation and etc. in the build-up in 20 years. To me, the time when the reactors are closed is actually more relevant than the total cost. So the cost gap is probably less significant overall for a large program like that than the timing. If you have to shut down 10 years, 20 years earlier than planned, wow, that's a massive difference when it comes to fund calculation. So it's a very serious point.
So along with all of the dynamics that have been discussed, I think we can't underestimate the influence specifically on Ontario of the Power Workers Union and energy companies like Bruce Power and Enbridge, which are now the same thing. And of course the political dynamics in your region where there are a number of politicians whose votes rely on people who work in nuclear plants. So I think it's important to just be real about that political dynamic.
This may be our last question.
It's a narrow question. Thank you, sir, for your talk.
And your
Balance sheet. Dave McNichol, citizen. Question mark. Surf. Balance sheets.